All right, hello everybody and welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be in Unit 8, the Cold War, Lesson 1, the beginning of this Cold War, Part 2, okay? So remember to take out your notes and let's go ahead and just pick up where we left off last time. We were talking about the beginning of the Cold War, which is the struggle, keep in mind, between the Soviet Union and the United States that's going to pick up before World War II is even over, at the end of World War II. And it's going to go all the way until like the 1990s. And in some ways, it's still a war that's being fought. And the reason we call it a Cold War is that it's not a typical war. It's a war that is fought in unconventional means. It's a war over ideologies, different ideas about the way the world should look and be. Our idea and our way of doing things is known as democracy. That's our system of government, specifically, representative democracy, our constitutional republic, where we are led by the people that we decide to rule us. We elect our leaders. We have a say as people. Versus the communist government, the communist system is called, communism. That's what the Soviet Union has. And under communism, everything is controlled by the government. And you basically have a dictatorship or a small oligarchy, a small group of leaders at the top of the Communist Party that control everything and everybody. It's almost like you're a slave to the government. As far as different economic ideas go, remember we have capitalism. Capitalism, like we've been talking about, like laissez-faire, is more where businesses are free to do as they wish, versus communism, what the Soviet Union has, that is where businesses are all controlled by the government, and people's jobs, people's lives, everything is dictated by the government. So it's about these different ideas. That's the Cold War. Now, when we're fighting against the Soviet Union, because we had just ended the terrible awfulness that was World War II, we don't immediately want to jump back into another global struggle with the only other superpower that existed after World War II was over. And so to avoid all-out war, this is where we will find other ways to threaten and to fight in our war of ideologies. And this is also governed by the new invention of the nuclear weapon. Remember that at the end of World War II, America had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in order to force Japan to surrender unconditionally, to end the war. Well, when we did that, we showed the world that there was this new awful technology out there, and Stalin is going to get his hands on it. Within about 4 years, the Soviet Union will have nuclear capabilities. They will have tested their own atomic bomb. And this begins the nuclear age, which was a dominating factor during the Cold War. The reason that we can't fight the Cold War like any traditional hot war, where you have soldiers constantly shooting at each other and everything else, the reason why it has to be a Cold War, an untraditional type of warfare, is because of the threat of this nuclear weapon that both superpowers, both us and the Soviet Union, will possess. That if any one side, if either of us choose to use these awful new destructive weapons, we would literally destroy the planet. And so we can't have all-out war with each other. We have to find other ways to do this, like proxy war, as we will talk about with the conflict in Korea or the conflict later on in Vietnam. This is all part of the Cold War. And again, it's going to be around to stay. It's going to be from World War II all the way until 1990. Now, for how to navigate this very tricky, very tense situation in the Cold War, one of our leading advisors, Americans in Moscow, Russia, advised the usage of this containment policy we talked about last time. And remember, as Stalin was threatening to take Greece and Turkey, these 2 Mediterranean nations, because he wanted those warm water ports and he wanted to conquer these places, Harry Truman, the American president, will issue his Truman Doctrine, where he basically says that America will be following the policy of containment, that we are going to halt or stop the spread of communism by whatever means necessary, okay? So if this means we lend money to Greece and Turkey so that they can fight against the Soviets on their own and keep themselves free, that's what we will do. And that's what we did, and it kept Greece and Turkey free. If this means that we might have to ourselves send supplies over to keep a place free from communism, that is what we will do. That's also part of containment theory. And if ultimately it means that we might actually even have to send American soldiers over to an area in order to keep it free from communist expansion, that is what we will ultimately do. This is all part of containment theory, that we will stop the spread of communism by whatever means necessary. But remember again, look on this map, those places that are already under the Iron Curtain, that are, I should say, behind the Iron Curtain, those places in Eastern Europe we talked about, like these satellite nations here, such as East Germany, such as Hungary, Slovakia, okay? All of these nations in East Europe, the satellite nations, and those that had been annexed by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, such as Romania and whatnot, those places are lost to us. Behind the Iron Curtain, we can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't help them. Under containment policy, they're already lost. We're not going to try to fight the Soviet Union to reclaim them, okay? We're just interested in stopping Stalin and stopping the communists from expanding anywhere else. We're gonna halt the spread of communism. I know I repeated that like 5 times, but that means it's something really important that you need to stick in your brain hole, okay? Now, in order to help safeguard the countries of Western Europe to make sure that they would stay strong and be able to resist communism on their own, we are going to institute the Marshall Plan. Highlights or star, or in your notes, underline. The Marshall Plan is going to be named after our Secretary of State, George Marshall, who you might hopefully recall in World War II had been FDR's chief of staff of the entire military, like Eisenhower's boss. So now he is Secretary of State under President Truman, and his Marshall Plan is not a military plan, it's an economic plan. It's a plan to loan billions of dollars over to these countries in Western Europe. You could see the country that gets the most aid is our good friend and ally from World War II, the British. You could see France is going to get a lot of American money. You could see all these nations, including West Germany, because Germany at this time was divided up into East controlled by the communists and West that was controlled by us. But we're giving money and aid to the Western Germans, to Sweden, to Norway, to Denmark, to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Switzerland, even to Italy, and of course Greece and Turkey, where we were keeping them free from communism. All these places will get all this money so that they can rebuild after all of the terrible destruction of World War II. Remember, most of these places look like ruins from that terrible, terrible war. And so we're going to help them rebuild. This will have many side effects, okay? It gets these countries back on their feet. It gets their economies going once more, their industries, their agriculture going. This is going to help our trade. This is in turn going to help our economy. But it's also going to make these countries extremely indebted to us, extremely grateful and loyal to the United States. Because in the Cold War, the sides are forming, allegiances, alliances, and loyalties are forming. And we wanted to make sure that these places in Western Europe would remain free from communism. That's the Marshall Plan. It will help rebuild Western Europe. It was an economic plan of recovery. There's George Kennan, the analyst who will help craft the long telegram, which will be used to create the containment theory Truman implements in his doctrine, which guides us in our Cold War policies for the next 50 years. You can see right here that under the Marshall Plan, 38% of all of the aid that we are sending to Western Europe to help them rebuild was in raw materials, because they needed to rebuild. So they're going to need a lot of mortar, they're going to need a lot of concrete, they're going to need a lot of oil, they're going to need a lot of things to rebuild. 32% was in food so that they don't starve while they get their farms, going again. 16% in fuel, not just for vehicles, but mostly also in their winter so they don't freeze to death. 14% in machines and vehicles. This is the Marshall Plan, the assistance, the aid, the money that we are giving to Western Europe to help keep them free from communism and to help them rebuild after the Second World War. All right. Now, the front lines of this early parts of the Cold War are really in Germany, okay? Germany, where Hitler had been defeated there in Berlin, it's all going to be divided. Now, the division was agreed to at the Yalta Conference. At Yalta in the beginning of 1945, you can see right here, It was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 separate zones where the Allies would administer and help to rebuild and make Germany a place that would be more democratic after we had defeated it. Yes, Germany is our big enemy in World War II, but we defeated them. Now what do we do with our defeated enemy? Well, we're going to help them rebuild. We're going to help make them more like us so that you don't have a dictator that did the things Hitler did. And so each of these zones will be given over to an ally to help rebuild. The Soviet Union was placed in charge of the eastern part of Germany, this part in red, ironically, remember, because like red means communism. The United States would be given the part in blue, which is southern Germany today. The part in brown would be given over to the French, and the part in green would be given over to the British. Okay, so it's these 4 zones. Likewise, the capital city right there of Berlin would also be divided up, as you can see here, into these 4 different zones as well. You have East Berlin with the Soviet Union, and you have West Berlin divided among the Americans, the British, and the French. Okay, even though Berlin is in the eastern part of Germany that's under Soviet control, the city itself is also divided. Keep that in mind, okay? Now you can see what's going to happen 10 years later as these divisions of the Cold War cement themselves. You're going to have, instead of 4 zones, it just becomes 2. And now the eastern part, still controlled by the Soviet Union, okay, that's East Germany. The western part that had been under the control of the different zones of the British, the Americans, the French, now this is just West Germany. And West Germany will mainly be administered by the Americans, because again, we're the only real superpower of the Western world left at this point after World War II. So these are the dividing lines. And again, Berlin, the capital city, even though it's in the eastern part controlled by the Soviet Union, now Berlin is a divided city, just East Berlin controlled by the communists, West Berlin controlled by us. And this brings us to the first real test in containment policy, known as the Berlin Airlift, okay? Now remember, at the end of World War II, we'd established the United Nations as a kind of League of Nations Part 2. This is the symbol for the UN. Its headquarters is in New York City. And you figure that us and Stalin would have been able to work something out. But again, Stalin wants to dominate Eastern Europe. He's doing exactly what Hitler did, okay? He's a terrible dictator that's trying to take over places and subjugate people. We needed to stop him. Luckily, Truman, under the containment policy, has a different method than just straight out all out going to war. What Stalin's doing here in East Berlin, let me go back to the map, is he is going to basically shut down, he's going to blockade all of the roads and bridges, all the railroads, every access point that we had to bring supplies and people into Western Berlin. Here's West Berlin, okay, and the zoom, here's the city itself. Stalin has closed all the roads, bridges, and railroads, everything that would allow us to go from West Germany into Western Berlin right here. Stalin has shut them down. And Stalin plans to take over the rest of the city once America leaves it behind, once we surrender it. Stalin also doesn't want to go to war because nobody wants to start World War III. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. But he also really wants West Berlin, and we really don't want to let it go because we don't want to let any place that is free fall to communism. This is our containment policy. And so this is where the Berlin Airlift is going to happen. How do we get around Stalin's blockade? How do we get around all of these closed roads and railroads that he has shut down without leading to conflict, without killing anybody? Well, we just simply fly over them. Genius, right? So we are going to fly our big planes over into Berlin, into the city of West Berlin. There was 2 major airports. We land our planes here. Sometimes our planes aren't even going to land. Sometimes they would just simply fly over and drop crates with parachutes at specific landing sites. That way, crates don't land on poor little German boys' heads and stuff. And in these crates, we're going to provide everything that the citizens of West Berlin needed in order to keep themselves going. Because Stalin has blockaded their city, West Berlin was completely cut off from the rest of the world. These people were running out of food. They were running out of coal, you know, to keep their homes warm when it gets freezing cold temperatures there. They were going to starve and die, and they would eventually be forced to surrender to Stalin, which is what he wanted. But we will not allow that to happen. Because of containment policy, America will institute, along with our allies, the British, the Berlin airlift. We fly plane after plane after plane into the city of West Berlin to keep those people going, to deliver supplies. And so we deliver millions of pounds of food, fuel, everything they needed. There was like 1,000 pounds of candy that was dropped for the little Berlin children. We drop all this stuff to keep the people of West Berlin going, to keep them free, so that West Berlin would not fall to communism. We did this for about a year. In 1947, 1948, we continued plane after plane, all these supplies we gave to the German citizens there, until finally Stalin lifts the blockade. We never gave up, and finally Stalin gives in, and we're allowed to resume sending supplies in through those roads. So that was the Berlin airlift. It was a successful first test for our containment policy, showing that we could keep the world safe from communism. We could keep places free without having to directly go to war against the Soviet Union. And in 1949, after the Berlin airlifts, the United States, along with our allies, are going to form our team, our alliance in this Cold War. It's called NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and NATO will be around until today. We actually still are part of NATO, although Trump tried to get us out of it. And NATO is going to be the countries that you can see on some map that I should have somewhere that I don't. Okay, so NATO will be all of the countries that you see in Western Europe, including Greece and Turkey as well. And on the other side of the Atlantic, NATO is also going to include the countries of Canada and the United States. That's why it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, you know, England, France, all of these countries will be part of NATO. Now, the Soviet Union, they're going to want to have their own team, which will become known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact will be the Soviet Union, its satellite nations in Eastern Europe, and all of the other communist nations that they will have join it. So these are the teams in the Cold War. NATO is blue. Obviously, the Warsaw Pact is going to be red, because red is the color of communism. And so that's a picture right there. Now you understand that's the picture of the Berlin airlift. We are flying supplies in to keep the citizens, like this little boy of West Berlin, fed and free, so that they do not surrender to communism, so that West Berlin does not fall to communism. Here you go. Here's the nations that have joined NATO. You can see West Germany is on that list eventually. And here are all the nations, the satellite nations, and the Soviet Union itself that are part of the Warsaw Pact. Free versus communist. Which NATO countries were not located in Europe? Well, Canada is not in Europe. You could also say Iceland is sort of affiliated with Europe, but it's in the middle of the Atlantic. Let's see, also have the United States. Turkey is partly in Asia as well. All right, with that being said, that is the end of lesson 1, the beginning of the Cold War. I hope you guys spend this time now working on your summary. So again, here is the essential question. What was the Cold War? Talk to me about this struggle, this ideological struggle with the atomic bomb, the nuclear age between us and the Soviet Union, and how did it begin? Talk about how it began before World War II even ended because of what Stalin was doing, occupying Eastern Europe. So write a few sentences. Remember to answer that essential question in your summary at the bottom of your notes. And when we pick up next time, we'll be getting more into this Cold War. Thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you later. Bye. Maybe.